This message is for like-minded members of the resistance against this fascist movement who aren't afraid to hear opinions that are different from their own. This message is not for single-digit IQ MAGA gun nuts who have replaced their entire personalities with knowledge of caliber sizes and who worship guns because the gun companies have told them that they're as cool as cigarettes were in the 50s. If you find firearms on a whole scary, that's okay. Guns are designed to kill people, and pro-gun activists need to stop acting like it's a moral deficiency for people to be scared of guns. But in this video, our newest host, Eris, has a well-researched, receipt-filled, nuanced opinion about firearms, their restrictions, their history, and the resistance. It's okay to disagree with anything she says, and we encourage debate in the comment sections. And if you can't handle that, then go cry somewhere else, you lefty snowflake. Thank you.
Enter the assault weapon.
Resist! Resist! Oh, oh, oh! Resisting! Resist!
You were taught to fear what you couldn't see, not to ask why the fear was there, nor to question who profits from it. You were trained, yes, trained, with this manufactured fear, to believe that your safety would only ever come from control. Something's wrong? Well, let's try to control it out of existence. More cameras, prisons, laws. You were told that if you just gave up enough, your trust, your autonomy, the fear would go away. Thing is, it didn't. It never does. Because fear isn't a flaw in the system. It's a feature that enforces a false sense of security, all at the cost of control over your own body and your obedience to a system that doesn't give a damn about you. It never has. Gun control, like all other forms of control, is no exception. Now, some of you in the back already understand this, but far too many don't. It's never been about your safety, but about your containment. The system has long since aimed to reserve the means of force for those already in power, and regulating out of existence the autonomy of those deemed too dangerous to be trusted. But have you ever asked yourself, who gets to be seen as civil? Who gets to be trusted with defense? Going back all the way to the 1600s, laws in the colonies were created to disarm freed and enslaved black people in the Virginia colonies. Meanwhile, in the South, colonizers engaged in continual acts of warfare, betrayal, and eradication against the native populace, all paired with disarmament. These efforts served as preludes to many further atrocities, such as the Trail of Tears, the Wounded Knee Massacre, which, by the way, was a gun confiscation massacre. These atrocities were just that, but they weren't created in isolation, nor were they the only targets. After the Civil War, black Americans were systemically blocked from owning guns. White America was absolutely terrified of the idea of a black person with a gun. As if much has changed. We call these policies the Black Codes. These bigoted laws laid the groundwork for Jim Crow and the crisis we still see today in over-policing. Don't believe me? For years, slave catchers operated at the behest of the state, bound by their oaths. For example, here's an oath of a North Carolina slave patrolman. I, insert name here, do swear that I, as a searcher of guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs, to the best of my power, so help me God. These slave patrols were the very basis of our modern policing system. All for one goal, to deny black Americans the means to resist their oppression. And with the white supremacist populace happily abiding in the creation of these laws, they realized, little too late, that it would come for them eventually too. But only after coming for the immigrants next, especially those that were poor. Irish, Italian, Chinese, any number of other nationalities. All that mattered is that they were poor, and that they were an other to be fearful of. High degrees of poverty among the immigrant communities led to heightened degrees of mistrust, resentment, violence. Sound familiar? And where there is violence, or the manufactured fear of it, the system of control shifts its rhetoric for the times. Instead of exclusively racist pretenses, the controllers of the time decried these communities as well as their violence. Laws were enacted across the country attempting to disarm these people. The easiest way? Make it illegal for non-citizens to be armed, and then make it impossible to become a citizen. And we're still doing this today. Remember Christian Ortega Lopez? The guy that was recently arrested for being a alleged Tren de Aragua, but his only crime is being Venezuelan and holding a wrong object. according to the government. We did it back then, and we're still doing it today. The law we charged him with came later at a federal level, but we were already doing this at a state level. For instance, the grandfather law to California's concealed carry policy was born out of working-class anti-Chinese racism. The early progressive movement, for instance, emerged from this genuine concern about industrialization's social impacts, but it was deeply intertwined with white nativism and social control. The progressive movement's prohibitionist wing often targeted immigrant communities and their drinking cultures. Prohibition was motivated partially by this desire to control the undesirable immigrant behaviors. So instead of solving for complex systems that enabled rampant alcohol problems, we enabled far greater threats to the system. Prohibition created an underground economy dominated by organized crime coming out of the very same immigrant communities they demonized. This led to a cycle of escalating violence as gangs fought for control, often using automatic weapons like the Thompson submachine gun. Newspapers at the time, smelling blood in the streets, sensationalized gangland violence, manufacturing a moral panic. It just needed a catalyst, and the gangs were certain to provide. Thus, in the depths of the Depression, the National Firearms Act was passed. Initially, crafters of the policy had even wanted to ban pistols, which is why the law includes provisions against short-barrel rifles and shotguns. But the proposal eventually was removed from the final bill. What instead passed was a watered-down, yet still just as discriminatory law that required the purchase of a $200 tax stamp to own a machine gun, a short-barrel rifle, short-barrel shotgun, or explosives. At the time, the amount of money and the complex and permissive bigotry process made it all but certain the only people who would be able to still have these tools, even those that were citizens, were dependent entirely upon your class. The primary target had shifted, but the machinery of the state continued to churn on. And it was about to shift again, reacting to an era of black liberation. It goes without saying that the 1960s was also a time of intense hatred, violence, poverty, and animosity. With racial and political tensions at all-time highs, and the state enacting even greater violence against the innocent and marginalized, it was only right that the black community began to take community defense incredibly seriously. The Black Panther Party and organizations like it emerged out of this, and this scared the system greatly. And once the system was scared, the disarmament regime was poised to act in bipartisan fashion.
The Black Panther Party rose from concern about the increase of police violence against black citizens in Oakland, California. Unlike the nonviolent movement of Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers believed that blacks should act aggressively in their own defense when police violated their rights.
Newton and Seal very much understood this as a matter of rights, and so part of how they would police the police was that they would carry guns, because in 1966 in California, it was legal to carry an unconcealed weapon. But part of what they would also carry was tape recorders, legal case books. The part of the idea behind policing the police and the police patrols and then educating the community was about what are your rights vis-a-vis the police, and making the police have to live up to those rules and to those rights, and kind of transforming the relationship between the police as sort of an occupying force or a force that was sort of not there to protect necessarily the black community, and beginning to say, no, we are not going to allow this kind of policing.
First with Ronald Reagan's California's Mulford Act of 1967, which banned the open carry as a direct response to the Black Panther Party's protests. Then later, in the 1968 Gun Control Act, the largest of their gun grabs to date. The long-term goal of these laws was to defang and then suppress, just like normal again, except it wasn't. The GCA was a sweeping consolidation of state power, sold to the public as a response to political violence. But what it actually did was formalize the gatekeeping regime. It created a national framework for licensing and prohibitions under the Department of Treasury, which then laid the groundwork for what would soon become the ATF. That's right. Your favorite agency that loves to shoot dogs came out of the Treasury Department. If you didn't know that already. It criminalized ownership based on arbitrary classifications like felony status, even the nonviolent ones. But soon, a backlash came from white gun owners, veterans, survivalists, and so-called constitutionalists, who were the privileged but now finally impacted. And because of that, there was a reaction. And the state responded, not by scaling back its power, but by reframing it with the 1986 Firearm Owners Protection Act. On paper, FOPA was a Reagan pro-gun correction. It limited the ability of the ATF to harass gun owners. It loosened some interstate transportation laws. It ended record-keeping mandates and ammunition practices. But buried deep inside, almost casually, was the Hughes Amendment, which banned all future civilian registration of fully automatic firearms. In other words, if you didn't already own a machine gun, you never would. It didn't ban machine guns outright. Instead, it let the market do it. Prices of these guns soared. Legal ownership became the dominion of wealthy and well-connected once again. Ironic. The government made it illegal to pay a tax. FOPA didn't fix the GCA. It fortified it. Machine guns are still generally legal to own. You just can't own one. You can't afford it. And with the registry closed, the effect is the same as a ban. Containment through capitalism. And it worked for its goal. But even then, that wasn't enough for the disarmament regime, because it had just learned a lesson. It was all in language. As overall violent crime rates began their long decline in the 1990s, the disarmament regime needed a new emotional anchor for a new era of gun control, and they found it in the spectacular horror of mass shootings. Unlike everyday violence concentrated in marginalized communities, violence the system is perfectly comfortable ignoring, mass shootings pierced the veil of safety that middle-class white America had constructed for itself. Schools, shopping malls, movie theaters, your job, these spaces that were all once deemed as safe were no longer guaranteed as such. And that kind of violation demanded a response. Enter the assault weapon. Much has been said of the illegitimacy of the term already, and much of it from an audience that any liberal would keenly ignore. But they weren't entirely wrong. The term didn't come from the military or firearms engineers. It came from consultants who understood that fear is easier to legislate than fact. In 1988, Josh Sugarman, founder of the Violence Policy Center, created a strategy that would reshape American gun discourse until now. He wrote, "The weapon's menacing looks, coupled with the public's confusion over fully automatic machine guns versus semi-automatic assault weapons, anything that looks like a machine gun is assumed to be a machine gun, can only increase the chances public support of the restrictions of these weapons. In addition, few people can envision a practical use for these weapons. It was on the basis of this misconception and confusion that they aimed to obscure from the public what they were really doing. But even then, at the time, assault weapons weren't as widely owned as they are now. Sugarman was accurate when he said few people could envision a practical use for them. Outside of right-wing militias, the AR-15 had yet to take on the imagery it holds today. The 1994 assault weapons ban, ironically enough, might have actually been the cause of that. There's a parallel here to the early 20th century prohibitionists I mentioned earlier. Behind their moral crusading and nativism of the temperance movement were women who had watched alcohol destroy their lives, their families, enabled great violence against them and their children, and left them destitute while their breadwinners drank away their wages. The concerns were absolutely legitimate. Their analysis of power, however, was not. Similarly, the horror of mass shootings is very, very real. But the analysis that focuses on the tool rather than the broken systems that produce such violence is fundamentally flawed. For politicians, the focus on assault weapons offered a perfect storm of political utility. It allowed them to appear to be doing something without challenging fundamental power structures to economic systems. Go ahead, ban a specific configuration rifle. You can claim action without addressing poverty, healthcare, community disintegration. It's far easier to draft legislation against a tangible object than to imagine the social conditions that make violence so likely. So what happened? They banned guns for how they looked, not for how they operated. Pistol grips, folding stocks, flash suppressors, bayonet lugs, grenade launchers, all cosmetic features. And predictably, it didn't stop mass shootings. Their own report indicated that the data was inconclusive. What the legislation and movement actually accomplished was twofold. It primed a generation of liberals to see disarmament as synonymous with morality, making gun control an emotional reflex tied to whiteness, suburban safety, and the aesthetics of a calm, of a managed society. Secondly, the category of assault weapon, or high-capacity magazines, was turned into a political football, and identities became formed around the gun itself. And when the provision wasn't renewed in 2004, the floodgates had opened up. There was demand bottled up for a decade, and the market filled it. What was once rarely owned and often scorned by even members of the NRA became ubiquitous, and all future attempts to regulate them out of existence was to be met with the utmost of hostility. Guns were primed to be a totem in the impending culture war, complete with manufactured arguments on both sides, and neither of them having the right one that supported the side of the marginalized. Then came Sandy Hook. The pieces were already in place. It would have just needed a tragedy to play out to trigger it. If it had happened years before, the outcome would have been starkly different. But the partisanship and the culture war had long been waging, and as a consequence, any legislative potential quickly fizzled out. What gun control legislative successes that would come would only happen at a state level. Despite this being a temporary setback for the pro-gun side, it was a deep emotional wound in the anti-gun heart, and this wound was left to fester because it was profitable to do so, both politically and monetarily. Every death emboldened their moral authority. Every mass shooting that would only be met with thoughts and prayers, the wound widened, and with it, so too did the anger at those who disagreed. If it would just save one life, it was replaced with statements like, "You just want dead kids." Meanwhile, the pro-gun side offered absolutely no true retort beyond bullshit, astroturfed so-called grassroots talking points and gestures towards individual liberty. Neither side had the answer on how to solve the problem, either deliberately due to special interests in bribery, primarily, but certainly not exclusively, on the side of the right, or inadvertently because their minds are absolutely incapable of envisioning a systemic response to a problem, and because their paychecks were dependent upon it. Instead of addressing the root disease, we've become absolutely focused on trying to treat the symptoms with medicine we've already seen doesn't work. And this medicine only covers for discrimination. For decades, the system had done its best to maintain a delicate balance, letting the right people continue to keep their guns and keep the wrong ones tied up in paperwork, waiting periods, and denials. And then came Bruin. In 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that May issue concealed carry permit laws were unconstitutional. This overturned the Sullivan Act, which was a law passed in 1911 in New York, due in no small part to anti-Italian bigotry. No longer could states require citizens show good cause or special need in order to carry a weapon. However, this was far from the only impact of the case. It made it clear that the legal standard when looking at arms ban cases must be viewed with a strict scrutiny lens. What does that mean in practice? No more assault weapon bans. No more concealed carry laws. Most forms of gun control under this standard would be ruled unconstitutional. A plethora of Bruin response bills were launched at a state level attempting to recreate the conditions of this May issue regime without actually saying it, because what May issue really meant in practice was systemic discrimination. White wealthy suburbanites? Approved. Black single mothers in dangerous neighborhoods? Denied. In places like New Jersey, California, and Maryland, carrying a weapon wasn't a right, but a privilege granted almost exclusively to the privileged. After Bruin stripped this discretionary power, New Jersey Democratic Assemblyman John McKeon revealed his underlying racist bias when opposing reduced permit fees in the Bruin response bill.
I'm passionate about this issue too because in my opinion, maybe tone deaf isn't the right word as opposed to just maybe a little bit disingenuous. Do either of you, does anybody really want to put more guns in the hands of people that live in Patterson and Newark and Elizabeth and Camden to say here, oh, the money you're charging isn't fair? That'll make things safer? Please. The point being is that how can anybody think putting guns in the hands of people in the city to make it easier to want to provide a supplement like we would for food so they can have a concealed and carry weapon would be really something that you mean.
Does anybody really want to put more guns in the hands of people that live in Patterson, New York, Elizabeth, and Camden? Each of these cities he named are predominantly black and brown with high poverty rates. Let me say that again. Each of these cities are mostly made up of poor black folk that are already suffering from systemic violence. Meanwhile, his white ass represents a predominantly white and wealthy district. His concern was very clearly had nothing to do with guns. His only issue was who would be empowered to carry them. Instead of asking whether or not Newark needs fewer guns, should have been demanding better schools, healthcare, housing, and economic opportunities. These are the very things that make violence less likely in the first place, but will never happen unless we make them happen. When we look at where violence concentrates, whether that be gun violence or otherwise, we find it in areas marked by poverty, limited educational opportunities, inadequate healthcare, housing instability, and environmental degradation. Sounds like the United States, doesn't it? Comprehensive analysis of homicide rates across the U.S. consistently show that violence correlates not with gun ownership rates, but with inequality, poverty, and the lack of social mobility. These are but a few of the many social determinant factors of violence. It matters if people grew up surrounded by this violence, in conditions of artificial scarcity and stress. Not only because violence is learned, but these very situations do permanent harm to brain development in children who grew up in these situations, making them even more likely to experience and perpetuate violence. The cycle continues. So by focusing on only restricting access to a specific method of harm without addressing why people seek to harm in the first place, you don't eliminate the harm, you displace it. Japan and South Korea offer sobering examples. Both have virtually no private gun ownership and negligible gun deaths, yet their suicide rates significantly exceed that of the United States. For now, people denied one outlet find others. The point is that by removing one of the means, we hardly eliminate the despair. When we obsess over the tool while ignoring the crushing conditions that drive people to use it, we mistake the symptom for the disease. A society with fewer guns but the same level of alienation, economic precarity, and untreated mental illness will still be a violent society, just with different weapons and different outlets. I understand, though. The idea of more guns equating to higher levels of violence seems intuitive, but the data tells a more complex story. Over the last 30 years, the number of firearms in American civilian hands has more than doubled to at least over 400 million, all while homicide rates have fallen roughly 50%. During the same period, most states have also relaxed their concealed carry laws. If the simple presence of firearms were the determining factor, we would expect to see corresponding increases in violence, not decreases. This doesn't mean that more guns reduce violence. That would be an equally idiotic claim. Rather, it suggests that violence responds to factors far more fundamental than a mere tool availability. Economic conditions, social cohesion, public health resources, and community trust correlate far more consistently with violence rates than do firearm ownership statistics. And speaking of statistics, you've likely heard time and again that having a gun in your home increases the risk of being killed by one. This talking point derives from studies that found associations between gun ownership and homicide victimization. But a fundamental flaw in these studies is that they suffer from serious methodological limitations. Often, they're unable to distinguish between guns acquired for protection in already dangerous situations versus guns introducing danger into otherwise safe homes. They also don't typically control for crucial variables like involvement in high risk of activities or neighborhoods. Most importantly, these studies commit what statisticians call an ecological fallacy. This is when you apply population-level correlations to individual risk assessments without accounting for specific circumstances. The reality is that risk varies dramatically based on factors far more significant than the mere presence of a firearm. Programs like Advance Peace and Cure Violence, which focus on healing community trauma and creating strong economic alternatives to crime, have reduced shootings by up to 45% in the areas that they operate. They did this all without having to manufacture a single new gun law. The human relationship with tools is neither inherently destructive nor inherently virtuous. It simply is. Just as a bear has claws and teeth for protection and sustenance, humans have developed tools throughout our existence. A firearm is just that, a tool. No more a cause of violence than a pen is a cause of poetry. The outcomes are determined not by the tool itself, but by the systems, conditions, and intentions surrounding its use. Responsible ownership, then, becomes not just an individual imperative, but an act of mutual empowerment. Consider the community defense initiatives that have emerged when traditional protections fail or become threats themselves. Earlier this year, a group of armed neo-Nazis drove a packed U-Haul onto the overpass on the I-75 near Cincinnati, and the community reacted exactly as they should have. They banded together and tried to force them back. The Nazi rally was quickly dispersed with the police guarding their retreat. The community, rightfully, was enraged by the situation and demanded action, but the police, predictably, did nothing. So in response, armed men began appearing in the nearby tightly knit suburb of Lincoln Heights. Word got out, and armed patrols began to grow. The community became the police, and the community was glad for it, especially after decades of fighting with CPD over the location of their gun range, which was poisoning the land and adding undue stress to the children of the community. They formed the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program, and the Nazis have yet to return. This pattern repeats globally. For example, the Zapatistas in Chapaya have maintained their autonomous zones for decades. Their armed defense has enabled the continued existence of their self-governance. Similarly, in Rojava, community defense forces had protected vulnerable populations from ISIS, the Turkish military, and the former Assad regime, all while building one of the most progressive social experiments in modern history. Perhaps most telling, then, is the case of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Faced with genocide, the people turned to 3D printed firearms to survive, such as the FGC-9, which stands for Fuck Gun Control 9mm, a weapon that was specifically designed for this purpose by a German Kurd. When faced with tanks, drones, and the full apparatus of the state, these improvised firearms haven't provided victory against the junta, but they have provided something far more important. They have forced their oppressors to pay a price for their aggression, complicating the calculus of their extermination as they rearm themselves from the oppressor's corpse. And that's what the kids like to call a loot drop. These examples expose the hollow nature of the common retort. But what about tanks and drones? The argument suggests that since civilians can't outmatch military hardware, resistance is futile. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that asymmetric conflicts aren't determined by technological superiority alone. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, supposedly superior forces had been stymied by determined resistance equipped with far less sophisticated weapons. The goal of community defense isn't to win a conventional war, but to make aggression costly enough to prevent it in the first place. You want the Nazis scared to come down your street. The system knows this. It's why disarmament will always ever flow one way, from the people to the powerful. It's why the same governments that restrict civilian ownership continue to militarize the police forces while making gun law exceptions for retired law enforcement personnel. The message is clear. It's not the tool that concerns them, it's who wields it. Breaking the cycle requires building parallel structures outside the logic of state control. And thankfully, this work is already happening. Across the country, mutual aid networks are addressing material needs that the market and the state refuse to meet. Community defense organizations are training responsible firearm owners in both technical skills and de-escalation techniques. Harm reduction initiatives are saving lives outside of punitive framework of the war on drugs. These are countless avenues that need to be approached. I acknowledge that this is not easy work. In fact, probably amongst the hardest that we're ever going to do, given the alienation of our society. But it can be done. We've seen it. It requires moving beyond both the false sense of security of gun control and the hollow individualism of mainstream gun rights advocacy. It requires seeing the connections between disarmament and disenfranchisement, and understanding that true safety comes from building systems where control becomes unnecessary. The goal is not to live in a world where no one has weapons. The goal is to live in a world where no one finds need to use them. We build that world by changing the conditions, not by stripping people of tools or rights. We do it by building communities rooted in mutual aid, dignity, trust, and material stability. You never needed a state for that. You needed solidarity. That's how violence proceeds. And when control fails, as it always does, you're still going to need people ready to defend what you've built. So go out there and build it.
Hey, yeah, you. Before you click away to watch someone unbox a tactical toothbrush, let's talk about something real. Political Drain isn't just another content mill. We're a digital front in a very real war. Not with bullets, but with ideas, with action, and with solidarity. We pair urgent news with critical education. And we build community around actual resistance, not the hashtag kind. The kind that moves. But here's the thing. None of this is free. It isn't. Behind every video is time, labor, research, and some weird guy asking if we're going to pay the hosting bill. And yeah, some of that money goes to things we can't necessarily say out loud. If you know, you know. Let's just say our special ops aren't Call of Duty LARPers. They're people making real moves to protect, uplift, and organize. You're not just funding a channel. You're funding a resistance network in a world where capital still calls the shots. Unfortunately, in a system built on artificial scarcity, even mutual aid has a price tag. And if we want to grow, if we want to win, we need your help. We need your help. So if you've got even a few bucks to spare, toss it our way. It's not for ads, it's not for merch drops, but for people making moves in the shadows so others can do it in the light. It's just us and you. So fund the mission, fund the fight, fund the future, because nobody's coming to save us. We save each other. That's how this works. Follow us on all these things you see here, and our link tree is in the description. Maybe even get some merch.